Reminiscent of Thucydides' Trap, China has risen as an emerging powerhouse, leading to apprehension within the current hegemon, the US. The US is facing challenges in restraining China's further ascent. In order to avoid war, the United States is blocking China's development by mobilizing all factors other than military power to prevent China from challenging US hegemony.
In the 5th century, Thucydides said the inevitable war between Athens and Sparta was due to the rise of Athens and the consequent fear that permeated Sparta. Prior to the Persian invasion of Greece in 490 BC, Sparta held hegemony in the region. It was widely known in the world that Sparta had been operating for a long time in a way that the national system itself maximized combat power.
All boys entered military school at the age of 7, began training for war, and completed 23 years of service before gaining full citizenship at the age of 30. Under the hegemony of Sparta, the Greek city-states, which were living well in their own way, by checking each other and coexisting, faced a new threat around 490 BC. This threat was the emergence of Persia, which dominated the entire present-day Middle East and established the first great empire of humankind. When the great empire that existed in the Middle East invaded Greece in 490 BC, the city-states of Greece, which had previously threatened each other, desperately defended themselves by cooperating with each other to repel their huge common enemy. And finally, in 479 BC, the allied forces of the Greek city-states were able to keep peace by repelling the Persian invasion several times. However, in Greece, which became a fierce battlefield against Persia, the seeds of new divisions among the city-states were sprouting little by little. After Greece won the war against Persia, the balance of power in Greece began to change little by little to a new reality. At the time, Athens, a maritime nation that was rapidly emerging militarily, culturally, and economically, played a huge role in the war against Persia, along with Sparta. Athens showed off their strength in the war against Persia, and thus gradually emerged as a force challenging Sparta's supremacy. After the war with Persia, Sparta and Athens began to show off their strength and threaten each other, making a close rivalry. The two countries also achieved a state of peace that lasted for 30 years through a peace treaty for mutual non-interference and mediation by a third party. However, these two countries eventually went to war with each other, the worst outcome, and both countries fell into ruin. The renowned historian of that era, Thucydides, asserted that the underlying causes of the war between Sparta and Athens were rooted in conflicting interests, notions of honor, and the pervasive influence of fear. As Athens grew stronger, they became more arrogant and began to provoke Sparta, as Sparta's anxiety over the rise of Athens was developing into a pathological level of paranoia. Thucydides' history of the Peloponnesian War which delved into the intricate political dynamics between Athens and Sparta during that era, holds a significant status as a foundational work in the development of contemporary realist international politics.
The Thucydides Trap, which is now widely known in the academic world, shows how the rise of emerging nations instills tremendous fear in existing hegemonic nations. The hegemon, feeling fear, tries to block the growth of the emerging country, and the two countries eventually begin to face conflict, which may eventually develop into war. Scholar Graham Allison analyzed the wars of the past 500 years, such as those between Athens and Sparta, saying that the deepening of these conflicts leads to extreme results of war.
This scholar has selected 16 cases of wars that have reached the moment of power transition between the challenger and the hegemon. And it was found that 12 of them eventually fell into Thucydides' trap and faced war. If you look at the simple numbers, the probability of war occurring at the moment of power transition is as high as 75%. Emerging countries in general will increasingly want to seek their interests and heightened entitlement to international recognition and respect.
The hegemonic powers fear the rise of emerging powers and their relative decline, and come to perceive emerging powers as arrogant, provocative, and threatening. Currently, the competition is rapidly escalating between the US, the hegemon, and China, the challenger. Since the reunification of Germany in 1989 and the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, the United States has achieved and maintained the unipolar order as the victor of the Cold War and the only hegemon in the world. NATO, formed by the United States to defend the Eastern Bloc communist satellites, continued to expand its forces even after the collapse of the Soviet Union, playing a huge role in maintaining an international order centered on the United States and the West. However, the United States, which has had such an overwhelmingly dominant military, cultural, and economic position, also began to face a new threat on a completely different level, just 10 years after it reached its unipolar status. That threat was the 9/11 terrorist attack against the United States by Islamic terrorist groups in 2001. Since then, the United States has declared a war on terrorism and has begun to implement more frequent military measures such as the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. These military actions caused a rapid drain of national power, causing controversy over the relative decline of the United States. Meanwhile, since Deng Xiaoping's reform and opening in 1978, China has begun to achieve rapid growth under the US-centered market economy system. The United States also supported China for the purpose of containing the Soviet Union and spurred China's growth. After the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, China began to emerge as a threat to the liberal camp in earnest. Entering the 21st century, the United States' national power declined due to the war on terrorism and the global financial crisis of 2008. Meanwhile, China has grown rapidly at an average annual rate of 9.6%, finally surpassing Japan in 2010 to become the world's second largest economy. The United States elevated China to contain the Soviet Union, but as China grew and threatened the United States realized it had raised a baby tiger. The rivalry between the United States and China that has developed in this way is an example of the Thucydides Trap, in which nations face increasingly escalating conflict.
According to the power transition theory of international politics, there are several conditions for a peaceful power transition without war between emerging countries and existing hegemonic powers. First, when emerging countries are satisfied with the current system established by hegemonic countries. Second, when emerging countries do not seek leadership and hegemony within the international system. Third, if emerging countries do not reveal their ambitions for territorial expansion. Fourth, if emerging countries and hegemonic powers are culturally similar. Fifth, when a hegemon needs help from an emerging country in a crisis situation such as war.
For example, in the early 20th century, the United Kingdom, an existing hegemon, and the United States, an emerging country, inevitably faced a power transition situation. However, at the time, the United States was satisfied with the international order established by Britain, and the United States pursued isolationism and tried to avoid intervening in world affairs as much as possible. In other words, they did not want to pursue the leadership and hegemony that Britain had. And at the time, the United States had no ambitions in British colonies.
Since they formed the same Anglo-Saxon ethnic community and spoke the same English language, they had a high degree of cultural homogeneity. Finally, during World War I, Britain received full assistance from the United States in the war against Germany, another emerging power. Due to these factors, the United States was able to peacefully inherit hegemony after World War II without incurring problems from Britain, the hegemon at the time. However, looking at China and the United States, China is already clearly showing its ambitions for leadership and supremacy in the international community. China is showing its territorial expansion ambitions in the surrounding areas where US allies are located, such as border disputes and disputes in the South China and East China Seas. In addition, culturally, the United States and China show obvious differences, and their political systems of democracy and communism are distinctly different. Therefore, if we look at the US-China competition through the lenses of power transition theory and the Thucydides Trap, there is a high possibility that the conflict will escalate into physical confrontation or clashes. Many realist theorists likewise hold a deterministic view that a military conflict will be inevitable when a power transition occurs. So these days, the United States is pursuing a strategy to frustrate China's hegemony without going to war, instead of suffering enormous loss of life and property due to war with China. The US strategy is to implement several tactics to prevent China from pursuing the US any longer economically or militarily. First, the US is adopting a decoupling policy to diversify its supply chain to thwart China's growth. The decoupling strategy is a strategy to withdraw companies of the free camp from China and move them to Southeast Asian countries or India. Second, the Chip-4 alliance was formed to block access to cutting-edge semiconductors so that China's technology could not be devoted to military equipment due to its high growth. Third, they are encircling China by forming military alliances, such as the Quad Alliance, Korea-US-Japan Triangular Alliance, and Five Eyes against China. As for China, it is externally challenged by Western countries such as the United States, and internally it has problems such as unemployment due to economic recession, population decline, and social welfare cost increases due to aging. In addition, China is a communist state, and there are many internal contradictions, and if these internal problems are not overcome, it may collapse on its own.
So now the US is dealing with China with a decoupling strategy so that China can no longer develop economically. And the United States has also prepared a de-risking strategy to reduce the risk that Western technology and equipment will enter China and be used for military equipment that then threatens the West. The act of banning the transfer of advanced semiconductor technology or advanced science from the West to China is a de-risking strategy. China is violating the universal values of humanity by ignoring human rights and suppressing freedom. So the United States is expanding its alliance with liberal democracies that value human rights.
As mentioned in the theory of Thucydides Trap, Athens, a rising power, challenged Sparta militarily, and the conflict eventually developed into a war. Likewise, the US is exerting pressure to prevent China, an emerging power, from challenging the US in order to maintain its hegemony without going to war. First of all, by mobilizing all elements other than military power and joining forces with liberal democratic countries, China is blocking and suppressing China's growth so that it cannot grow any further. Thank you for watching the video Thucydides Trap, provided by History and Current Events. Gina, Bella, and Tony have contributed so far as narrators. Thank you.